will of God, seeks God's will. I think another thing I talked about, mentioned here is this. A natural leader enjoys power. This is very important because I think oftentimes, especially when you rise up higher in the leadership scale, we need to be careful that we don't like power too much or lording over people too much. And I think the difference between a natural leader and a spiritual leader is this. Natural leader, obviously, there's times when they enjoy power, but a spiritual leader delights in obedience to God. A natural leader is independent, but a spiritual leader depends on God. And here's the common myth, and I think someone mentioned this before, that position or title is what makes a leader. This is a very common myth within leadership, that position or title is what makes a leader. I think there are two phases of leadership that I basically want to talk about is this. There's a stage of leadership where having a title in some ways makes you a leader automatically, right? Because I have a title of a pastor, some of you guys might see me as a leader. But that doesn't make me a good leader. It doesn't even make me a qualified leader. It doesn't make me even a leader that's worth following because it's all based on a title or a position. And I think this is very important, especially those of us who are young in leadership, which is all of us here, that I see a lot of people who really love title or position. They love being, a small group leader, a Bible study leader. They love having that title, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a good leader, a qualified leader, or a leader that's worth following. And again, I think this is one of the biggest myths in leadership. Because you and I know some pretty terrible leaders who have very high positions. In the world today, whether it be a president of a company, or a CEO of a company, whether it be a manager or a boss, even though they might be the highest ranking person in their company, doesn't necessarily mean they're a great leader. I worked at the University of Pennsylvania after I graduated doing IT work, and I worked for this lady. She was the head of our department, and not to just slam on her, but I just thought she wasn't a great leader for various reasons. She wasn't good at managing people or delegation. She wasn't clear in communication. And when I think about my time working, I realized that, again, it doesn't matter what kind of position that you had. Position and title only get you through the door, right? But then there's so much more to leadership. There's so much more. You need to win people's respect. You need to be someone who, as some of you guys talked about, have humility. You need to be a person, a man or woman of character in order for people to follow you. So again, position or title is not necessarily what makes a leader in itself. So what is the goal of leadership? And we kind of talked about this at the very beginning. The goal of leadership is one word: influence. The goal of leadership, and I think there's one thing I want us to remember out of this seminar is this. The goal of leadership is influence. If you can influence someone, then you have leadership. You are a leader, right? Now, this is very important because influence doesn't necessarily have to be positive. When you think about great leaders, I even think of people like Hitler. He was an absolute great leader because he was able to influence. Obviously, it was for the wrong reasons, right? But when you look at anyone who could influence others, they're a leader. And the more people you can influence, the more of an organization you can influence, the greater leader that you are. The definition of influence I want to state like this: the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something with the effect itself. The capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. When you look at Jesus, and we'll look at more examples of Jesus, but right when he was called to the ministry, we see him basically go out to his disciples in Matthew chapter 4. And what he says is this: while they were walking the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you a fisher of men." And so right off the bat, we see Jesus' influence. We see him. I don't think, these guys followed Jesus just because of his title. I don't think they even knew who Jesus was. But right off the bat, Jesus was able to influence 12 guys to come follow him and change the world. A couple quotes I want to throw out there. Leadership is the process of influence. Anytime you seek to influence the thinking, behavior, or development of people in their personal and professional lives, you are taking on the role of a leader. Leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. So as a spiritual leader, how are we supposed to influence people? How are we supposed to influence people? Even before I throw out, things that I wrote, any ideas how we're supposed to influence people? Go ahead.
By example.
Okay, by example. Okay.
By teaching.
Okay, teaching. Go ahead.
Be relatable.
Okay, relatable. What else? Go ahead.
By loving them.
Okay, loving them. Okay. What else? Go ahead.
As a spiritual leader, I think you need to have an intimate relationship with God.
Of course, yeah.
You need to not just knowledge of no spiritual leader really well, but have a regular conversation with God in prayer. And
Good.
now that I don't think you can be a spiritual leader.
Good. Good. Anyone else? As a spiritual leader, I think the first thing is this: they lead others closer to Jesus. I think that's the most important thing that you can do as a spiritual leader. When you're called to be in a position of leadership, whether it be small group, whether it be a women's ministry, whether it be a worship ministry, whether it be a pastor or missionary, the most important thing as a spiritual leader that you're supposed to do is to lead others closer to Jesus. Your role as a spiritual leader, my role as a pastor, is all I'm trying to do is just lead people closer to Jesus. And as some people mentioned, that is done by teaching, by loving, by relating, by investing into people. And so we can't get so stuck on leadership is about me. I think that's one of the differences between being a natural leader, and being a spiritual leader. Being a spiritual leader, you gotta just right off the bat say it's not about me, but you gotta point others closer to Jesus. I think the second thing is this: they lead others to discover their own purpose and identity. They lead others to discover their own purpose and identity. This is very important because not only are you trying to lead people closer to Jesus, but I think you want to also try to lead people in what they're called to do as well. And I think this is very important because whether you're leading a small group or whatever it may be, everyone's gifted differently. Everyone has different passions. Everyone has different goals in their life in terms of how they want to be used by Christ. And I think one of the things as a leader is to not only invest in to love them, but really trying to find out who they are and how God has gifted them and trying to find their own purpose in God's leading. I think the third thing is this: they lead others to transformation, not just production. This is really important because as a spiritual leader, I think oftentimes we will fall into the category of leading others just to get things done. And I think some of that's necessary. But as a spiritual leader, I think one of the things that, especially when you lead others towards Jesus, is that you should be concerned about them transforming, them changing. At the end of the day, as a spiritual leader, you need to ask yourselves, are people becoming more like Jesus? And I think that's one of the challenges I face as a pastor as well. At the end of the day, I need to really ask myself, and just in all honesty, I need to really ask myself, are the things that I'm doing, is it really leading others to transformation? And I think no matter what kind of context you're in ministry, I think you need to always ask yourself that. Are the things that I'm investing in, are the Bible studies that I'm leading, are the times that I'm praying for people, are the times when I'm discipling people, is it leading for that other person a closer relationship to Jesus? Not only that, is it leading to transformation? I think the fourth thing is this: they gain a following because of who they are, not because of a position they hold. And I talked about this briefly. Influence and spiritual leadership, people will follow you because of who you are. Right? People are going to follow you for who you are. People are going to follow you for what you're passionate about, what you're convicted of. People are going to follow you by how you pray, how much you love Jesus, how much you love the Word. People are going to follow you because of your own character and your own convictions. And in the beginning, they might follow you because you have the title of a small group leader, They might follow you because you have the title of a worship leader, but in the end, you're only going to influence them because of who you are. And that's the reason why people are following you. How was Jesus able to influence? And we briefly talked about this. Number one, discipleship. This is so important. One of the things I'm learning as I'm planning a church is that I can't lead people or expect people to follow just by a title. And I think one of the goals that me and my wife had in the very beginning of our church planning experience is this, that we need to be intentional of investing and discipling people. And I think as a spiritual leader, again, no matter what spectrum you're part of in that spiritual leadership scale, it's so important that we invest into people, that you really pour your life into people, that you love people, that you sacrifice for people. People need to know that you care. And that's what Jesus did. When he called his disciples, it was a life of discipleship. For 3 years, Jesus poured his life into these 12 men, and more specifically, 3 men, that he just poured his life into them. I think that's the way you influence people, by discipleship. I think the second thing is this, we talked about it, it's by love, by loving people. Again, you as a spiritual leader, people under you should know that you care. And that doesn't mean that you have time to invest into everyone equally or the same amount. Because it's just impossible. Right now at our church, we have about 50, 60 people that come. It's just impossible for me to invest into everyone equally. But I really hope that, the people who come, they would have a genuine sense that, me and the rest of the leaders, they know that we genuinely care about their spirituality. Jesus did this by eating with quote-unquote sinners in Luke 15. He also did it by teaching. This is so important because Jesus not only did Jesus love, but he did it by teaching. In Matthew chapter 7, it says that they were amazed at the way that he taught. They were amazed at the way that he was able to recite scripture. And so, things like Bible study is important. Things like one-on-one discipleship based around scripture is so important. Things like Bible memorization is so important. Because in those times what you're actually doing is you're teaching people the Bible. You don't need a seminary education. You don't need you don't need an MDiv to teach people the Bible. But I think it's so important that, again, that the way that we influence people is through teaching. I think the fourth thing is this, through servanthood. It's so important when you think about your own spiritual leadership that you're becoming more and more of a servant. And one of the tragedies that I see in leadership is this, that as we hire in a position, we feel like we should be entitled. And I think that's the wrong way to go. I think someone mentioned it in our discussion, but you can't expect others to be a servant if you're not willing to be a servant. If you're not willing to go get snacks when no one feels like it, you can't expect other people to do it as well. If you aren't willing to go pick up people for rides, you can't expect other people to do it as well. And I think it's so important as you rise up in your spiritual leadership, as you rise up in position, that you are becoming more and more of a servant. And I think it's so important that we, especially in this generation, that we get out of this entitlement mentality. That I deserve this. I have a certain title, so I deserve this. But, we should be the ones who are most humble. Another thing is this, he was able to influence by healing. And I don't know how much this is going to happen in our own ministries, but this is obviously one of the ways that Jesus was able to influence. When you look at the way that Jesus healed people, he was influencing them. He was showing himself to be the Savior, the Messiah. And you look at almost every single healing event in the ministry of Jesus, he was influencing them. Influencing the leper, he was influencing the blind man. He was just basically revealing himself of who Jesus was. And I think it's so important in all of these things that we try to imitate Christ in our leadership. I want us to take a few minutes before we go on, and I'm going to give us some time just to process some of these things. So I'm not just bombarding with a lot of information. And so in your groups again, in your groups of 3, I want you to think about, what it means to influence people, or maybe something in your own area of ministry where maybe God is calling you to influence others. When you think about this whole idea of who are you called to influence, and how do you feel like God is calling you to influence them? Okay, so why don't we talk about that for a few minutes, or you can talk about anything else that came up in this presentation before we go on to the rest of the seminar. Okay, let's do that for some time, and then I'll close time together.
In The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren, where he talks about everybody comes to a point in life where they need to figure out if they want to impress people or influence people, because the two are opposite ends of the spectrum. He said, you can impress people from far with perfection, but in order to influence people, you have to draw them in close so that they can see your imperfections and flaws, because those are what give you credibility.
Wow, it's good. It's good. Do you guys all hear that? You guys hear that? It's good. Anyone else? Think about influence before you move on. You know, for me, one of the things about church planning that I've been learning is I need to identify people that I can influence. Because just because people come to our church doesn't necessarily mean I can influence them. And I think that's one of the challenging things for me as a young church planner, as a young leader, is really finding those people who you can invest into and influence. Because not everyone's going to be influenced by you because of who you are, your personality, your style of leadership. And so I think that's one of the things that we should keep in mind, that obviously, let's say a small group setting, you're not going to be able to influence everyone. There are going to be maybe a few who are going to respond to your type of leadership where you can really pour into. And so for me, especially in this whole church planning experience, it's all about discerning and finding wisdom of who really likes my style of leadership, who really wants to be influenced by me, who can I really invest into that will respond to my leadership. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as you rise up in spiritual leadership. You shouldn't get really frustrated so much if people aren't responding. It's just that maybe you're not the type of right leader for them, or they're not in a season of life where they want to be influenced by you. But it's finding those few that really want to be influenced by your leadership. And so I think it's very important.
I just want to add one more thing.
Yeah.
As a spiritual leader, I think it's important to have a Timothy, Paul, and Barnabas in your life. Timothy, somebody who can disciple. Paul, someone who can disciple you, and Barnabas, someone to encourage you, especially during difficult.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll try to touch on that maybe tomorrow about the relationships that we need in terms of to become a better leader. But yeah, that's very important. Anything else before we move on? All right, so again, the number one thing you want to think about in spiritual leadership is, am I influencing people? That is the key thing about not only being a leader, but especially being a spiritual leader. Now, the next 5 components I'm going to talk about is what makes a good leader. How are you able to influence people? And so it's almost like influence is the top thing, and so the next 5 are, this is what makes up a good leader. So the first one is this. And I think this is the number one important thing. I'm going to say this again. This could be the number one important thing about becoming a spiritual leader. Is character and integrity. Character and integrity. What is character and integrity? The definition is it's the quality or state of being complete or undivided. Basically, you're not double-minded. You're not, this whole idea of being complete or undivided, you're not, like this in one, in your private life, and you're not like this in your public life. You're being full, you're complete, you're who you are in every arena of life. That's what character is. And it's so important, as young leaders, as old leaders, to have character. We all know of people especially in the church world, where they fall because of one simple act. and the character is done. You know, you read in the news today, mega church pastors falling because of immorality. One act and you're done. It's so important as spiritual leaders. And I think one of the things between, a leader that's, a not spiritual leader and a spiritual leader is because the difference is this. I think a leader in the world, people are most time forgiving. And not to say that the church is not forgiving, but, things like, for example, I'm going to use Bill Clinton. I don't know how you feel about Bill Clinton. But people are going to label Bill Clinton as a great leader, despite what he did in his private life. And I don't think you can take that same principle into spiritual leadership. You can't just say, well, he's a great leader even though he has terrible character. It goes hand in hand. Your character is the backbone of your influence. If you have zero character, you cannot influence others. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but some of the traits of having good character, just a few I labeled off here, is you're available, you're accountable, you're dependable, you're generous, you're honest or you're trustworthy, you're loyal, you're pure, you're sensitive, you're transparent. You are who you say that you are. Okay? A couple quotes I want to throw out there. Who you are when no one is looking. That's what Bill Hybels says character is. Character is what a man is in the dark. Character is the will to do what's right, even when it's hard, regardless of the cost. Character is not essential to leadership, but character is what makes you a leader worth following. This is so important. Character is not essential to leadership, but it's going to be what makes you a leader worth following. And again, I think the most important thing that we can develop as young leaders is your work on your character. I know some guys who don't have a lot of charisma, but they're great leaders because I can count on their character. They are who they say they are. Well, as I know some guys who are very charismatic, can draw people, but they have poor character. There was this one guy, I don't want to even say what stage of life I was in, but he was a great leader, very dynamic. He was able to influence others, could talk really smooth, but he had poor character. He couldn't handle his money. He had money issues. He was in debt. He had academic issues, failing a lot of his classes. And even though he was able to draw people, even to a certain extent, influence people, in the end, he wasn't a leader worth following because his personal life was a wreck. And I think it's so important as you look at your own area of leadership, you got to ask yourself, how's my character? How am I doing in the arenas of my academics, in terms of my finances? Am I someone who honors my family? Am I someone who, prays, who really loves the word, who, really loves other people? And I think that's so essential to leadership. Again, it's not dependent so much upon how charismatic you are, how eloquently that you are, but I think character is really what makes you a leader worth following. What's the most important quality in a leader? I found a survey and said this. According to a new survey of Christian adults conducted by the Barna Group, the primary answer is integrity. More than 64% of Christians say that integrity is one of the most important traits a leader must have. Other traits Christians say that are important are authenticity, discipline. In fact, adults chose all three of these qualities above passion for God. Less than 1/3 listed that as a necessary trait. The traits Christian adults were least likely to select as most important with humility and purpose. But I think it's very important that when you think about the survey amongst Christian leaders, amongst Christians, is they want a leader that has character. They want a leader who says what he says he's going to do. They want a leader who is not purposely hypocritical. I mean, we're all going to be hypocritical, but we all know leaders who are, they're blatantly hypocritical. Say one thing, do another thing. And so I think this survey hits it right on the head. When you think about character, and in terms of your spiritual leadership, you You need to understand that we all wear two badges. We wear the first badge of how we are in our private life, and then second badge is how we are in our private life. And here's the thing about spiritual leadership. You need to understand that you can't dichotomize the two. Right? You can't, again, the example that I give of Bill Clinton. You can't just have immorality in your life, in your private life, and have a great outward public ministry. Even though that might work for a little bit, in the end it's going to collapse. And so when you think about your own spiritual leadership, you need to ask yourself, how is my private life compared to my public life? Again, I think that's why Timothy and Paul list those qualities to Timothy. You should be a man of one wife. You should be gentle. You should be self-controlled. You know what he's saying? In your private life, you got to make sure that you're right. You're a person of integrity and character. Because in order for you to he says it in that verse, you can't lead a church, you can't lead God's people if you can't even take care of things in the home. And so that's the whole thing about private versus public. You need to understand that your private ministry is just as important as your public. Again, a couple of things that among students, one of the first things I see is your academics. Right? It is a terrible witness to the people that you are leading if you're failing out of your classes. I'm sorry, that's just a terrible witness. If you're doing terribly in your academics. I've seen another thing where people are in bad credit card debt. They can't handle money. And so that's another poor character issue where their private life is a mess, even though they're doing outward public ministry. How do you check your character? I think some questions to ask yourself. Number one is, what is your greatest temptation? And who have you told? These are all questions that you should be thinking when you think about your own character. You should know your own weaknesses. You should know your own temptations. You should know some of the areas of weakness that you have in terms of area of character. Whether it be the opposite sex, whether it be, pornography, whether it be financial issues, whether it be bad academics. I don't know what it is for you, but you need to identify what are those things that I'm most tempted by, and are we seeking some kind of accountability to tell other people? Am I doing something in my life where I'm trying to make sure I have good integrity and character in my private life? Like I gave that example of when you read about these mega church pastors that fall, their private life's a mess. And most likely, they weren't accountable to people. Most likely, they just wanted to do things on their own. And I think that's the first danger of being a spiritual leader is when you want to be independent, when you want to run, when you want to hide your life, when you want to hide your temptations, when you want to hide your junk. I think the second question you need to ask yourself is, do you have people speaking to your life about your character? That's the most, I think, important thing about character. You need to find people who are brutally honest with you. One of the things that I really appreciate about people around me in my life, especially mentors, is that they're not afraid to tell me the things I need to work on. They're not afraid to tell me some of the character issues I have. And I don't think you can be a good leader if you, number one, don't have those people, but also number two, I know people who just can't give criticism well. And if you're one of those people who are like, don't tell me what to do, or gosh, don't speak into my life, or don't tell me what's wrong with me, I think it's going to be very hard for you to grow up, not only as a Christian, but especially as a leader. You need to find people in your life where, not that they're always, putting you down, but really know you in a very real way and tell you, in those moments where, hey, I think you have some issues with, your pride, or I think you have some issues with the opposite gender. You need to find those people who can speak into your life. I think the third thing is this. What do you want to be remembered for? That's an easy indicator of where your character is. When you think about your spiritual leadership, you need to ask yourself, do I want to be known as someone who's charismatic? Do I want to be known as someone who could just preach a good sermon? Do I want to be known as someone who can, lead the masses? Yes, to some degree. But I think above all that, for a spiritual leader, I would rather have someone say, man, Pastor Dave was a man of character, integrity. He was trustworthy. He was a man of his word. I think that's really what's really important about spiritual leadership. And that's what's going to influence people. And I think the fourth question you need to ask yourself is, well, what's your plan? If you have character issues that you need to figure out, if you have things that you need to clean up in your life or find accountability for, you need to make a plan for those things. We'll go on before we break up. Second thing is this. What makes a great leader is clarity, or what I call vision. Clarity or vision. They all start with C, so it's very easy to remember. First one's character, second one's clarity. Vision is a picture of the future that produces passion. Vision is a picture of the future that produces passion. A leader is someone who sees more than others see, who sees further than others see, who sees before others see. When you think about a spiritual leader, whether it be leading a church or leading a small group, one of the things as a spiritual leader is that you should have a vision, a purpose, a goal for where you're leading people. This goes on in the secular world as well. People leave companies, people leave organizations because there's no vision in their life. One thing that's really true, whether it be the secular world or the church world, is that people really love following a vision. And I think that's one thing I love about AMI, because I think we have a great vision of impacting the college campuses, trying to influence people around the world. And I think that's what's great about our AMI community. But as a spiritual leader, the one thing you need to think about is you should have a vision for the members that you're leading. Now, does that mean that we're all visionaries? Not necessarily, right? Does it mean that all of us, are called to lead big things? No, not necessarily. When you have a small group, I really hope that in your small group, people really know what your small group's about, where you're leading them. In your discipleship groups, let's say you're a spiritual leader of a discipleship group, people should have a vision of what the end goal should be. By the time that we end our discipleship, we should try to reach these goals, X, Y, Z. And I think that's really important as a spiritual leader, that you're not so ambiguous about where you're leading people. I want you to try to figure out these two companies. Our vision is to be the Earth's most customer-centric company, to build a place where people can come to find or discover anything they might want to buy online. That company is Amazon, right? Even from their vision statement, we know what they're all about. They want to be a consumer-centric place where you can literally buy anything online in Amazon. And we all know that because most of us probably use Amazon. And it's so clear from their vision statement what their purpose is. And I think they're fulfilling that purpose. This vision statement. Blank's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Google. Right? Google. Very clear. Very defined. We all know this because we all use Amazon and we all use Google. And I just share these examples because it's so important to have that kind of clarity, to have that kind of vision, no matter what you're leading as a spiritual leader, that people know where you're taking them. Where there is no vision, the people will perish. Proverbs 29:18. Jesus himself, right before he gets ascended into heaven, he gives a mission statement to his disciples, and he says this: "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." And so, at the end of Jesus' life, I think he sums it up with this statement right here. He says, "I'm going to heaven. I've come back. I've showed myself." He says, one of the last things he says to the disciples is, "Go make disciples of other nations." And almost every single church that you go to, their vision statement is based around this. Because I think that was Jesus' vision for his disciples and for the world. And so, when you think about even the life of Jesus, he basically left them saying, this is my vision for you guys. Go and do it. And I just wanted to, again, share that because it's so important to think about where you're leading people and where you're taking people. How do we get vision? A couple of things. Number one is prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting. No one could tell you what your vision is for the ministry that you oversee. No one can tell you the vision for your small group. It's got to be you. And that's only done through fasting and prayer. And no matter where you are, again, in your spiritual leadership, you can't expect others to give you that kind of vision. You can't expect others to give you that kind of purpose in what you're leading and the people that you're leading. But it's got to be your conviction, obviously, from fasting and prayer through the Word. You should try to talk it over with other people, but it's got to be your own, prayer and fasting. I think the second thing is this: solitude and reflection. Solitude and reflection. The way that we get clarity or vision is you need times where you escape the noise of the world, where you escape, what people are saying. You need to find times where you're alone with God. You're reflecting on the way that God has, built you and given what God has given you a passion for. I think it's the third thing. I just put it out there, but you need to clean up sinful patterns in your life. It's hard to hear from God. It's hard to get a vision for what you're leading if there's sinful patterns in your life. And I think that's one of the things that we should be aware of. And the third thing is this: by observation. What do I mean? The way that we get vision, I think, is to observe what God is already doing. Again, when I moved to Raleigh, Durham, to plant the church, the first couple months, I just wanted to see what God was up to in the area. And, just from my own prayer and observation, there were a lot of other great ministry that were going on, but I just wanted to see, God, how are you already moving in this area? And when you think about spiritual leadership, you should think about, how is God already moving in your small group? You have to think about, out of that, how do you want to lead them? What is your vision for them? I think another thing is listening. Listening. Basically, listening to the voice of God, listening to other people, not so much that they're telling you the vision, but as you try to get feedback from them. I think that's another way that we find clarity and vision in our life. Any questions or thoughts up to this point? Go ahead.
For your third point, cleaning up sinful patterns, is that I guess, staying above reproach? Is that what you mean?
I'm sorry?
Staying above reproach?
Staying up, I'm sorry?
Above reproach.
Oh, yes, staying above reproach, yes, definitely. I think, what I mean by, cleaning up sinful patterns is if there's addictions or just other sinful patterns that are ongoing in your life, I think it's really hard to hear from God. It's really hard to have that kind of clarity and vision. You need to clean up the things in your own life first, I think, before you hear from God and how God wants you to lead other people. And so, I think that's definitely, being above reproach. Anything else? All right, we're going to break up one more time. And basically, again, in these times of breakup, I just want us to kind of think about the things that were shared and process a little bit more. So in your groups, I want you to talk about either some of the things that you got from character or clarity and how that pertains to you specifically. Okay? So why don't we do that for our last time, breaking up with one another, and then we'll come back together in a few minutes. Okay? Character or clarity amongst your groups. Anything interesting you guys talked about in your groups? Okay.
When I went to OCS prep in the Marine Corps, my captain, he was telling me that your character will trickle down into your men. So when you're leading people, if you have poor character, it'll reflect in your the people who you're leading, and it's just something that you wouldn't expect. The little things, I don't know, the way you manage your money or whatnot, and that will eventually trickle down, and you can see it in
Definitely.
and spiritually, you can see that in your congregation.
Yeah.
You have character flaws and whatnot.
Definitely, yeah.
I really like that point, and I think that's really important for fathers or families.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The one thing I thought about is like, one small thing I thought about is like, as a spiritual leader, is like, we shouldn't be late to things. You can't expect other people to be on time or early if you're always running late. I see that a lot. It's like, yeah, even the small things matter. Your character's always on display. Good.
With your point about your private life must equal public life, I can relate to that a lot, especially like Pen's campus. I feel like a lot of times, I don't know, GCC people are like everywhere and they also come in and out. So I especially feel that because I live off campus now for the summer, and even if there are times when I want my own little bubble, a lot of times I see people and they see me, so it's really hard, I feel like, to like hide my private self. So I agree with what you said about how it should really be like the same, because I think, and I think in general I'm a very transparent person too, so yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's important that you try to lead your private life so you're not, hypocritical.
Yeah.
I think that's, it's important.
Kind of building on that, our group came to the conclusion that since character is so core to your ability to influence others, that leadership should really consider a way of life,
Definitely.
lifestyle,
Yeah,
job, position.
definitely.
I need to come to my group where I'm getting my MBA right now, and because of that, I'm taking a lot of like strategic management and leadership classes. And I have yet to hear about the emphasis on private life and maybe a little bit on family, but it's more like managing other people and all these external things.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference between secular leadership and spiritual leadership, because secular leadership is about your abilities, your talents, your charisma, how you can influence people, but rarely do I ever hear in secular leadership things about your character. But I think more and more people are wanting that. People of integrity, but again, it's not really emphasized. So, definitely. But did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna quote Mel here.
Okay.
He was sharing this morning about how in business he talked about leaders need to have a telescope to see the stars, to know like where the group is going, but they need to have people with microscopes on the team to maintain the details. Because if your effort fails, everyone's gonna have a microscope to figure out why things broke. So you need to have more telescopes.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah.
Put that in the PowerPoint.
But the thing that I took away from it also is that like, a lot of times I think that when you're trying to do something for the sake of the ministry, for the sake of the kingdom, the immediate short-term needs kind of supersede the reasons why you're doing it. So like figuring out a location, a time, a place, and then when you're actually there, you totally forget about why you had the event in the first place. You're why you have the effort. So you end up like having a kind of meet up with people in your small group or whatever, and talking about things that have nothing to do with advancing the kingdom or encouraging people or things like that. So,
Yeah. Go ahead.
We were kind of talking about this earlier about democracy and almost like people who don't necessarily maintain that integrity of character that even though they speak the truth, it's going to sound like lies coming from them. We were thinking about moments when Lincoln appeared in the critical even though they're called to this leadership position, we realize that inevitably it's going to happen perfect. We realize the important quality of leadership is repentance and transparency. Opening yourself up to
Yeah.
the trying to attack against it.
We're all guilty of hypocrisy. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I was sharing about how I feel like sometimes when I receive see the vision, but I feel like I don't know how to carry it out, or it doesn't make sense to me in the moment. A lack of trust makes me want to throw it away or kind of dismiss it. But that, like, I've seen so much, especially this past year, how if you trust him, like, he'll iron out, the Lord will just iron out all of the facets of the vision. So, like, you can run with the vision and, like, run that he'll change it along the way, but, like, yeah, that even if it's big, it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And then how small and humbled I feel that he just carried it, and I cannot say that I was willing to carry the vision out.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely.
I think listening for me has been something that I think like really stretched in the past few years. Like I used to have a very small number of people whose words I felt like were worth listening to or like turning over. And I realized that when let's say like I heard a criticism and I didn't feel like the person had any like place in speaking on that. But it's like a different person said the same exact thing, all of a sudden it's a different message.
Yeah.
And I realized that when my heart was more focused on like being accepted or being approved of, then that's when I would kind of pick and choose who I was listening to. But then when my focus became on just myself, like wanting to grow and like behind the scenes in my heart, wanting those things to change, even if somebody was coming from a very maybe even ignorant, but if they were like angry or speaking out of personal whatever, like still learning to like separate the emotion, separating that from what they're actually saying, and being able to use that to reflect on my own self.
Yeah.
And I think that really helped me in terms of my growth, knowing that like God can use the non-Christian to speak into your Christian leadership, or God can use the person who you feel like you don't get along with, and you feel like they're motivated against like maybe like a personal thing, and He can still use that to sharpen you. And I think that's something that being more open to different kinds of voices, I think that's something that I had really learned to value.
Yeah, definitely. It's humbling too. We got it. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question about like accountability
Okay.
and how you think we should take that role on, because personally for me, I forget if someone mentioned it, but like accountability is hard when we feel like it's not our place to be, because in like fear of acting hypocritical or something.
I think the word accountability in the Christian circle today is used very loosely, in the sense where accountability is not so much just getting together and just sharing your life and saying nice things to one another. But when I think about accountability, there has to be an element where you're able to speak the truth in love. And I think accountability, I mean, you could do a whole other seminar about this, but you gotta find people who are trustworthy, who you, I think, just naturally relate with, who you respect their input and insight. And so, if you have those kind of relationships, then I think you're blessed, and you should try to utilize those type of relationships. But if you're always afraid to say something, because of people's perception of you, that's not really accountability. That's more just like making each other feel good, which is not actually very loving either. I think there should be times of encouragement and exhortation. There's got to be times where, hey, I see this in your life, and I don't know what you think, but this is what I just kind of observed, and I think it's important to find those types of relationships.
I think also like in the scenario where you feel like you don't want to speak up because you feel like you would be hypocritical, like I think that's a great opportunity for you to approach that person and be confident, like
hey, like I'm also struggling with this, but I know that like this isn't how things should be, and kind of inviting that aspect of like I'm not coming to you from having mastered this area of my life, or I'm not coming from you from some kind of soapbox, but on the same level, like this is something I see in your life because I also have it in my life. And I don't think you should ever be afraid to say what you know is right just because you feel like you're still struggling in that specific area.
Yeah. And that's true. You're not coming from a standpoint where you're better, you know, than another person, but out of love and concern. I think that's where accountability should be approached. Okay.
When it comes to vision, if you have like a situation where two different leaders have diverging visions,
Uh-huh.
how do you kind of reconcile those differences?
Two different leaders have two different visions.
Or like
Are they equal in position? Okay.
maybe.
Can you give me like an example?
So
I'll be
let's-
on
what if like a church's vision, like AMI, is all about missions and spreading the gospel, and then let's say somebody on staff, they're a little bit, let's say they're all about discipleship and kind of the in-house building. Like do you think the two should complement each other, or is it sometimes better that maybe like there's separate paths? Because not every church has the same exact vision, even if it's all under the umbrella of spreading the gospel, right?
Man, that's a
Case by case.
So you got to think about what the overarching vision is of the organization, and that's what the first place you got to start. You know, what is the overarching vision for Grace Covenant Church? You know, I think your vision is to raise up kingdom workers. You know, and then from there, I think each small group or whatever staff should be tailored to kind of fit that overarching vision of the church. Now, if there's two people with two different visions, obviously, those things need to be talked through, and you also got to think about, are they overseeing the same area? Are they equal in title? Obviously, for me as like a senior pastor, if another guy came under me and he had a different vision, if his vision doesn't coincide with what the overarching vision of our church is, then it's like, I'm sorry, it's like, I think the precedent over, just because of my position, should have the overwhelming authority and vision over. I mean, not to say that I don't make suggestions or, I welcome other people's ideas, but I think, it can get tricky. We gotta wrap up. I'm gonna finish up the second part tomorrow, and we're gonna try to spend more time in prayer tomorrow. But the way I just wanted to close is this: within your group that you shared with, maybe one person just can close, and just maybe even lifting up the other people in your group. Okay? So why don't we close that way, and then we'll finish. Okay? In your groups, one person just close.